Thank you very much. It's been fantastic coming to Taipei these last few days. I lived in Japan for a year, working in Japan, and I sadly never made it to Taiwan. I wish I'd lived a year here. It's much nicer than Japan. Before I start, I just wanted to say one thing, which is from the time I spent here and from the time we spent at Yongping Elementary School yesterday, one thing is very clear to me, that the education of children in food, the feeding of children well, all reflects the culture of food in society more broadly. And I know that you have had your problems, and there's a lot of fear and distrust about what is coming into the supply chain. But what I see here, what I've seen, is a fundamentally healthy food culture. If you compare the food culture here with where it was in the UK, and where I would say in many cases it still is in the USA, our plane had crashed, if you like. We're having to completely rebuild the culture from the bottom up, which is a massive, massive cultural job. Whereas I think you are wobbling, you've had some concerns, but you seem to be waking up to it early, and it feels to me like your job is one of prevention. You just need to pull up on the sticks a bit, and hopefully you can prevent the full-on catastrophe that's taken place in both the US and the UK. Before I start, I just want to show you a film which explains a little bit about the school food plan, and then I'll reflect on what we did and talk a bit about how it applies, or what lessons we can take from you and you can take from us. So this is a little film that we made about what we did with the school food plan. In July 2012, Michael Gove asked us to put together a new school food plan to answer two questions.
How can we get 5 million children in around 22,000 schools eating well?
And what role should cooking and food play in schools more broadly?
The first thing we did was get on a train and visit a school. And over the past year, we've eaten in more than 50 schools. We've spoken to pupils, teachers, parents, cooks, chefs, volunteers, charity workers, industry bodies, caterers, and farmers. And we've analysed in detail the economics of school food.
School food is in a far better state than we'd expected, thanks in part to Jamie Oliver alerting the nation to the horrors of the turkey Twizzler back in 2005, but also due to many, many people doing amazing things across the country.
However, there is still a long way to go. Due to poor diet, a quarter of all children in the UK leave school obese, whilst in 2012, the NHS spent over £10 billion treating illnesses caused by bad diet. That's the equivalent of 40 new hospitals every year.
The first illuminating moment came when we met the Children's Food Trust, who showed us a graph tracing the percentage of children eating school meals in England over the past 40 years. Take-up started at 70% in the late 70s, but then, like a cliff collapsing into the sea, crumbled away, sinking in the mid-80s to below 50%, the point at which school dinners became economically unviable.
With take-up currently around 40%, our school dinner service is like a half-empty restaurant. It's losing money, £140 million per year, to be precise.
And what are children eating instead? For the large part, unhealthy packed lunches. Only 1% of packed lunches meet nutritional standards. 2/3 contain sweets, sugary drinks, and snacks like crisps. This really matters. If children learn to eat well at school, they are more likely to eat well as adults and save the NHS billions of pounds.
But it's not just about health. Children who eat better learn better. If parents spent the close to £1 billion a year they pay on unhealthy packed lunches on nutritious school meals instead, we could make the whole school food system solvent again. If demand goes up, we can serve better meals at a lower cost.
So the plan's number one aim is increasing the number of children eating good school food. It is both the means and the end.
The plan's second aim is to support head teachers to help change their school's food. The only common factor we found in every school with great food was the ethos and culture created by the leaders in those schools, whether they were primaries or secondaries or academies or maintained rural or urban, new or old. 95% of head teachers believe eating well improves attainment and behaviour. The 40% want more support to make it happen, and our plan will give them that support. The school food plan is not a series of recommendations to be ummed and ahed over. It's a plan with actions agreed by the government and by people working in the sector.
The government has already agreed to make cooking compulsory in schools for all children up to the age of 14. They will also be supporting head teachers by setting up a fund for charities to work directly with many schools in the country to increase the take-up of good food. We will also be creating a website where teachers can go to see many examples of what works well in schools across the country and find contacts with people who can help them directly.
Public and private caterers are coming together to form an alliance to give the 58,000 school cooks, that's a bigger workforce than the Royal Navy, more training in kitchen skills to improve food quality and build morale.
With help from Jamie Oliver and brand guru Wally Olins, we will be spreading the word about the good things happening in school food. The government will be providing seed funding to set up breakfast clubs in a large number of schools across the country, where many of the children are eligible for free school meals. Finally, we are going to create 3 flagship areas across the country, which will show that with intense improvement in food in a given area, we can have a major impact on the health and attainment of the people living there. We have an ambitious vision, a financially sound school food system in which well-trained, fulfilled cooks serve flavourful fresh food to at least 70% of all pupils and will monitor progress annually.
We're going to build on the great work that's already been done to create a golden age for school food so that we all live in a country where we're healthier, happier and most importantly, more likely to win the World Cup.
There's been a lot of progress in our food. I can't say we're any more likely to win the World Cup than we were back in 2012, but you never know. So I just want to, how did I get there? That's what we've done. I want to talk a little bit about how I got to be working in the 23,000 schools in the UK. Me and John, whose voice you heard with mine there, founded Leon in 2004. And the idea behind Leon, we had been business consultants and we'd traveled around. And all we'd been able to get on the go in terms of food was cold, chilled sandwiches or delicious fried chicken that made you fall asleep and wake up fat. And that was, we felt unnecessary. We were eating more and more fast food as a nation, and there was nothing in the words fast and food that meant it had to be bad. So we set up Leon, which is a chain of fast food restaurants. We now have 50 restaurants, mostly in the UK. We have 3 in Holland, and we're going to be opening in the USA next year. We talk internally about it as McDonald's in heaven. So the idea is that McDonald's does a lot of good things. It's cheap. At least it's cheap in the UK. I know it's not as cheap as it is in the UK here. It's quick, but the food it serves kills you. So we wanted to set up something that was quick, where the food was served by angels, and instead of burgers, you got something that was both nutritious and delicious. Now, as we kind of worked on McDonald's, so on Leon, and as we learnt more about the food supply chain, it was originally a very selfish thing, Leon. We were doing it because we wanted to eat better. We wanted to feel healthier. But we learnt more and more about the supply chain as we had to. We now buy 12 million tons of chicken every week. And therefore, we buy a lot of food, we talk to a lot of farmers, and we began in about 2006 to become disillusioned with the supply chain, and also how difficult it was as restaurateurs, with everything else that was going on, to try and control your supply chain as well. So we set up a not-for-profit organization called the Sustainable Restaurant Association, and that does 2 things. It helps and supports restaurants in ensuring that they source good ingredients, they give back to the community, and they look after their resources and waste, and also, with Food Made Good, celebrates those restaurants that are doing great things so that others follow their example. And then following on from that, Michael Gove, who was the Education Secretary at the time, asked us if we could look at school food. School food in the UK had been incredibly politicized. Jamie Oliver had come in 5 years before us, and he had pointed out really terrible, terrible things going on in our schools. We were feeding children brown, beige, processed, fried food full of additives. It was shaming, and as a nation, no one had called it out. We all knew it was going on. No one had called it out. And what Jamie did is he said, this isn't good enough. Look at this. And he shone a light on it. And that created a very political situation. It created a lot of progress between when he came in and then when we followed. But when we arrived, people had moved from bad to okay and okay to good and good to great, but there was still a lot of work to do. And the reasons that we were able to achieve so much was that over the 5 years preceding Jamie and us, people had begun to take this really seriously. It used to be looked on as a kind of wishy-washy, liberal thing to do, to care about what you feed your children. And most people thought we should be focusing on maths and science. But then people started looking at the amount of money it was costing us. It was costing our nation, costing the NHS, and the misery that was behind those financial numbers. And they said, we need to do something about it. And while the reasons for commissioning the work are slightly different from the concerns that you face in Taiwan at the moment, the root cause behind them is the same. And I think it's really important to understand that. This is the school food plan. There's Jamie. He's a great guy, by the way, incredibly helpful, really passionate, amazing person. So why are we all facing these problems? Well, we're facing these problems because of something called the Green Revolution. Over the last 70 years, the way in which we produce and supply, cook and process food has changed as much as it did in the 12,000 years previously before the Neolithic Jordanians invented agriculture. After the war, understandably, a lot of parts of the world had had real suffering and malnutrition, and the global community and science in particular said we need to do something about that. And what they achieved was extraordinary. Without taking up much more land, we now feed 7.5 billion people from the same amount of land than which we fed 2.5 billion people in 1950. It's one of the most extraordinary human achievements that we've managed to do that without really serious mass starvation. But it has caused problems, and those are the problems that we're facing today. So the tools that were used to achieve that increase in productivity were oil-based fertilizers, breeding and then GMO to increase yields, pesticides, and then in the production, more use of chemicals, preservatives, the introduction of processed foods, and increasingly moving to cheaper foods, so replacing a lot of the calories with cheap refined carbohydrates and fat, and the flavors with salt and other additives. And so with this extraordinary thing called the Green Revolution came a number of problems. And those problems were the ones that we're facing in the UK: disease from food-related illnesses, from eating food that is not good for us. Secondly, a lack of nutritional in schools, in particular, children not being able to concentrate because they're not eating well. And then here, the problem you're facing in, with all of that increasing complexity, which had many, many positives, the supply chain becoming more opaque, and therefore bad things getting into the supply chain. So how do you fix that? And I believe that there are two problems that we're looking at here, that you're looking at. One is related to what David was saying, which is a very particular policing problem about fraudsters and charlatans who are trying to make a quick buck by putting things into your supply chain. And that is a governmental problem. That is a policing problem. It can be solved a bit by education. But actually, it's easier to fix than the other problem, which is a generation who can't cook, a generation who don't understand food, a generation who aren't connected to the countryside, to agriculture. So how do you solve that problem? What do you do, that second problem? Well, one thing's for sure, that the slide that we saw earlier suggested that government can control things. Well, actually, in terms of educating our children, in terms of what goes on in schools, the government has very little power. You can't pass a law to say, or well, you can pass a law to say all children will have excellent food education, excellent food in schools. But that would be simple, that's similar to a company CEO sending out an email saying, next year our profit will be $2 billion. Get it done. You could pass the law, but it's not going to happen. You can't send the army into schools to enforce them to do good food education and to serve the children food. So what can you do? Well, when we first looked at this, I did what all parents do when faced with problems involving children. I asked my children, this is George and Johnny and Dory, my children, about to be sent into schools to solve the problems. I asked them, this is a true story, I said to the guys, look, we've got a problem with children eating well in schools. What should we do about it? And George here is very thoughtful and quiet, George, and he said, well, what I think you should do is take the unhealthy food and secretly put healthy things into it so that we'll eat it. That's one approach. It's people put beetroot into brownies. It happens. Very clever. And then Johnny, here, very aggressive, he said, what you should do is take healthy food and make it look like fast food, like burgers and chips, and then everyone will eat it. That's good. But Dory, who looks, quiet but powerful, I liked her solution most. She said you should get a plate of healthy food, and then you take the child's head and you force it into the food until they've eaten it all. And if that doesn't work, put the food and force it into their mouth. Okay, so that wasn't going to work. So we then, as I said in the thing, we went around schools. We visited over 50 schools. And interestingly, what we found is that the schools that were doing good things all had three things in common. The first is leadership, and this is what was mentioned in the film. Every school where change had happened, you could trace one person, normally the head teacher, sometimes the school cook, maybe the school business manager, maybe a parent, who had said, this is not good enough, we need to change it. And that leadership had been maintained. You need someone there who is saying, this is the direction we're going in. And normally that first person, if the head teacher wasn't on board originally, the head teacher was the person who needs to say, right, this is where we're going, this is not good enough. But where are we going? What are we doing? Well, the second thing that all the schools had in common that improved their food and improved their food education was to adopt what we call a whole school approach. So they didn't see food just as something that was served to the children at lunchtime. They saw food and food culture as permeating the school completely. What does that actually mean? Well, in practice, it means teachers eating with children, something that doesn't happen a lot in the UK. It means that the cooks in the school have similar status as the teachers. In the UK, the cooks in the school used to be often the only employees who would come in through the back door and leave through the back door. And the cooks need to have the same status as the teachers. In many schools in the UK now, the cooks actually deliver the teaching lessons. So you are being served food by the same person who is later teaching you about cooking. And in fact, they might even be teaching you about the same dishes. It also means doing things like bringing food into other lessons. So this is a school in Richmond, in London. And Richmond in London, they have a business course. And on the business course, the children go to the supermarket and they buy produce and they look at it and they cost it and then they grow it and then they go to Borough Market, one of the big markets, and they sell it. They also, which you don't see here, make pickles and chutneys and they sell them, and they do that over the course of a term, and it teaches them not only about food, but about maths and money and business. So food isn't something separate, it's something woven through the whole fabric of the school. The third thing that all the schools have in common, this is from our lunch yesterday, which was delicious, is that the school actually cares about what the children like. Now, this might seem like an obvious thing, but actually in society, we very often look at kids, and particularly in schools, we look at processing them. There were 3,000 kids in the school yesterday. That is a lot of mouths to feed in a short period of time. And it's very easy to get into the kind of role of, feeding cattle. We need to get them through. We need to get the calories into their bellies and get them out. And actually, the schools that do well focus on what the children want. And what do the children want? They want food that tastes good. That's important. People often say, well, how do you make children eat food that's healthy? You make it taste good. It's not hard. Well, it is hard, but it's possible. They want the environment, the place they eat, to be quiet, to be a nice environment to eat. They care about their social lives and what goes on in the lunch break. They care about the price. It's very important. If it's too expensive, you don't have this problem as much here, but we have a big problem with packed lunches, where parents will give their children the same white bread with cheese and a can of Coke and a pack of crisps every day for lunch. But if you can compete on price with that, you can get the children to eat your food. And finally, the branding. And this was one of the wonderful things that we saw in Yongping yesterday, elementary school, was that how healthy food is perceived. The big industrial players, the crisp manufacturers, the big burger chains spend a lot of money making their food exciting. We need, in the schools, to make the healthy choice the exciting choice. Fruit can't be the things that the losers eat. We have to make the role models want the healthy food and eat the healthy food. So branding is very important and focusing on the need of the child. So what did we actually do? There's a lot that I think I can take back from here to the UK to teach them about. I'm actually now working with a small number of schools in Hackney, trying to transform the food in those schools, school by school. But what might you learn here? Well, there are some things the government can do. There are some things, and when things have got really bad, sometimes the government needs to say, this you must do. The risk is that becomes the minimum. That becomes what is actually the minimum becomes seen as solving the problem. But the government did three big things in our case. First of all, they made cooking compulsory for every child up to the age of 14. And not only that, but the way that the curriculum was phrased is very interesting. So we talked about, yes, the obvious stuff, principles, understand the principles of nutrition and healthy eating, but we talked about instilling a love of cooking in the children, in the same way that you want to instill a love of eating, a love of reading. So if children love cooking, everything else becomes easy. Cooking is one of the great expressions of human creativity. It's an extraordinary, even for the amateur, it's a very pleasurable thing to do. And if we instill that, will make a big difference. And then, really critically, this was something that was mentioned yesterday, and we had the same problem. When you start introducing cookery lessons, it's very tempting to do baking and sweets, because they're easy and simple to do. The first 5 cookery lessons, randomly selected, I went to in UK schools, were all cooking muffins, sweet muffins. So we put an emphasis on savoury dishes. So that was the first thing. We have a whole generation who can't cook. Let's use schools to help them cook again. The second thing the government did was introduce school food standards. You can go to the website if you want to read these, but this was about removing the worst from society, the worst foods from the food. It had been a system which some of you use here, computerized, typing in a lot of data. That became very, very mechanical and stopped chefs being creative. We said, let's have something we can put on the front of an apron. Those are the school food standards. There's nothing behind that. We took these things, food-based standards, put them on the front of the apron, sent them out to 40 chefs across the country to ask them to create menus and analyze those menus, and they delivered pretty much what the mechanical standards deliver. And then the third thing that the government did was a massive injection of cash in the form of free school meals for every child under the age of 8. So in the UK, if you're poor, if you have a salary of less than £16,000, at £16,500, you get a free school meal. But the government said, what we're getting is a us and them situation. For the first few years at school, let's give everyone free school meals. Let's encourage the teachers to eat with them. And what this did was bring money into the system. It took the school meals take-up from 48% to 80%, and it meant that eating school meals was the thing to do, not the thing not to do. It had a massive impact. But as I said, government can't do very much. What was much more important was what works well. So what we found, as we said in the film, was that everyone wanted to improve the food and the food education in their schools, but people didn't know how. And I was asked, a few times actually I've been asked, what can Taiwan learn from the UK? And I find this a very frustrating question, because I've seen it all the time, which is we all live in our societies, and we all think that everyone else is doing things better than us. So when we started the school food plan, we were told to go and look in Finland and in Denmark and in bloody Norway and Sweden, because Norway and Sweden are brilliant at everything. And we all do ourselves down. And we did go and look at those countries, and they did some interesting things. But actually what you'll find is in a country of this size, there will be schools, there will be people who are doing amazing things in your country. You can just get on a train and go and see it. And then what you need to do is take those examples, and this is where the government can help, celebrate them, communicate them, make those people who are doing great things visible so that people copy them and share that experience. So if there was one thing that I would ask you all to do, whether you're teachers or whether you're in the government or whether you are parents, is be that first leader, be that activist. If you think it's not good enough in your school, the food education, the food, bring it up with the head teacher. If you don't know what it's like, go and ask if you can see it. Go in and ask if you can sit down and have lunch with the kids. And as soon as you apply that pressure, you can create a network of people, and you create an energy that becomes impossible to resist. So, as I said before, I really think that you have such a strong foundation, your food culture, that if you can now just get that energy back, seize the initiative that some of these scares have given you, use that energy of the feel of a collapse to take off and to accelerate away so you don't become in a situation that we found ourselves in the UK and the US. Thank you very, very much for having me here. It's been a delight.
Thank you, Mr. Henry.